It was the mid-1980s in California, and a shadow of fear crept over the state. A series of brutal, random attacks struck terror into the hearts of residents. Homes were invaded in the dead of night. Men and women were slain in their bedrooms, and children were not even safe in their own homes. Whispers of a boogeyman spread. The press called him the Night Stalker, an elusive predator who struck after dark without warning. This is the true story of Richard Ramirez, how a troubled boy from Texas became one of America's most feared serial killers, and how a city's nightmare finally came to an end. Richard Ramirez, born Ricardo Levia Munoz Ramirez on February 29, 1960 in El Paso, Texas, was the youngest of 5 in a family ruled by a volatile father, a former Juarez cop turned railroad laborer who beat his children. Early trauma set the tone. At 5, a swing knocked him unconscious. Seizures followed, and neurologists later suspected temporal lobe epilepsy that could fuel aggression. To escape the violence, he sometimes slept in a cemetery, but darker influences moved in. At 12, he bonded with cousin Miguel Mike Valles, a Vietnam veteran who boasted of rape and torture, showing Polaroids of bound, murdered, even dismembered women. Instead of recoiling, Richard was fascinated. Mike taught him stealth and weapons. Richard started using marijuana and LSD, folding drugs into long nights of stories and alcohol. His sexual fantasies fused with violence, including bondage, rape, and even murder. On May 4th, 1975, he watched Mike shoot his wife Jessie in the face. Ramirez later said it fascinated rather than traumatized him. Mike was found not guilty by reason of insanity and confined, but the damage stuck. Richard withdrew, dropped out in 9th grade, and moved in with sister Ruth and her husband Roberto, an obsessive peeping Tom who dragged him on nocturnal prowls. After Mike's 1977 release, the trio sometimes stalked together. The boy who hid in cemeteries now hunted in darkness. At 18, working nights at a Holiday Inn, he used a stolen master key to burgle rooms and attempted to rape a guest until her husband intervened and beat him. Charges were dropped when the couple wouldn't return to testify. Another escape without consequence. By 22, he drifted to California, bouncing between Los Angeles and San Francisco, feeding a heavy cocaine habit with burglary and theft. He embraced Satanism, inverted his Catholic upbringing, reveled in blasphemy, puffed paint, used cocaine, and let hygiene collapse until his teeth rotted black. By 1983 to 1984 in Los Angeles, he was a drug-fueled drifter primed for violence. Richard Ramirez's path to murder began quietly in 1984. His first known victim was 9-year-old May Leung in San Francisco's Tenderloin district on April 10th. Ramirez lured her into a basement under the pretense of finding a lost dollar bill, then beat, strangled, raped, and stabbed her with a switchblade. In a final gruesome act, he hung her body from a pipe by her blouse. The crime shocked investigators but went unsolved for decades until DNA evidence in 2009 linked Ramirez to May's murder. In 2016, investigators revealed a possible juvenile suspect may have been present, though no accomplice was charged. At the time, the case went cold, allowing Ramirez to walk free after his first killing. 2 months later, on June 28th, he struck in Los Angeles. 79-year-old Jenny Vincow, who lived alone in Glassell Park, became his next victim. Ramirez slipped in through a window and attacked her as she slept, stabbing her repeatedly in the head, neck, and chest. The violence was extreme. Her throat was slashed so deeply she was nearly decapitated. After killing her, he sexually assaulted the corpse, then ransacked her home for valuables. This brutal combination of sexual violence, overkill, and burglary would define his signature. At Jenny's apartment, detectives found a vital clue: a fingerprint on the mesh window screen Ramirez had removed to enter. Yet, in 1984, with no suspect to match, the print led nowhere. Jenny's murder horrified investigators, but the case stalled, with no one realizing a serial killer was beginning his reign. For the rest of 1984, Ramirez kept a lower profile, funding his cocaine habit with burglary and car theft. On December 12th, he was arrested for stealing a vehicle. Police took a mugshot and fingerprinted him, capturing the gaunt face of the Night Stalker months before his spree began. He posted bail and vanished back onto the streets, free to unleash what would soon become a wave of terror. The year 1985 opened with quiet dread in Los Angeles, though no one knew the scale of terror that was about to descend. At first, the signs were scattered and strange, a string of child abductions that seemed unconnected. On February 25th, a 6-year-old girl in Montebello was taken while waiting for her sister after school. Stuffed into a duffel bag, assaulted, and abandoned on the roadside, she lived to tell her story. Just weeks later, a 9-year-old boy was dragged from his Monterey Park home in the dead of night, assaulted, and left alive in a park. Days later, an 8-year-old girl was snatched from her own bedroom in Eagle Rock and released after being molested. None of the children could identify their attacker, and at the time, police didn't link the cases. In hindsight, these were the first tremors of a storm, the early acts of a predator refining his dark craft. The carnage truly began on March 17th. That night, a stolen car brought Richard Ramirez into Rosemead, where he chose a quiet townhouse at random. Inside were Maria Hernandez and her roommate, Dale Okazaki. As Maria pulled into her garage, Ramirez appeared and raised a .22 caliber handgun. The bullet struck her keys, saving her life. She dropped to the floor, feigning death as he stepped over her and entered the home. Dale peeked from behind a counter, locking eyes with the intruder. He shot her instantly. Maria managed to flee, only to meet him again outside. This time, he lowered his weapon and walked away. She became one of the very few to escape his grasp. But Ramirez's hunger was not sated. Just an hour later in Monterey Park, he targeted 30-year-old Cy Leon Veronica Yu. Forcing her car off the road, he tried to drag her out and shot her twice when she resisted. She died on the way to the hospital. 2 murders and a survivor in one night threw Los Angeles into a frenzy. Maria's description painted a haunting picture: a lanky man in his mid-20s with curly hair, bulging eyes, and rotting teeth. Newspapers gave him chilling names: the Walk-In Killer and the Valley Intruder. Only 10 days later, the terror escalated further. In the early hours of March 27th, Ramirez slipped into the Whittier home of Vincent and Maxine Zazzara. Vincent was killed instantly with a gunshot to the head. Maxine awoke to horror as the stranger beat her, tied her hands, and demanded valuables. Seizing a chance, she freed herself and grabbed a shotgun from under the bed, but the weapon was unloaded. Enraged, Ramirez shot her 3 times, then mutilated her body in a frenzy. He carved a cross into her chest, gouged out her eyes, and carried them away in a jewelry box as a grotesque trophy. He fled with stolen goods, leaving devastation in his wake. When police arrived, they knew at once a serial killer was at large. The bullets matched earlier crimes, and a footprint in the garden from a rare Avia sneaker tied the cases together. Detectives Frank Salerno and Gil Carrillo quietly launched an intensive investigation, careful not to reveal too much. Meanwhile, whispers spread through neighborhoods. A predator stalked the night, and the worst was yet to come. If you find this story interesting, don't forget to like and subscribe, because we put up new stories every week on Fridays with Tony. Now back to the story. For a few weeks after the Zazzara murders, things were quiet. But it was the calm before another storm. Ramirez was likely laying low, perhaps fencing stolen goods or indulging in drugs. By late spring, he was ready to strike again. On May 14, 1985, he chose the home of Bill Doy and his wife Lillian in Monterey Park. At approximately 2:00 a.m., Ramirez slipped into the Doy residence through an open window. 70-year-old Bill Doy awoke to find a dark figure in his bedroom. Ramirez immediately shot Bill in the face with his .22 handgun as the elderly man reached for his own pistol on the nightstand. Bill collapsed, critically wounded. Ramirez then moved into 56-year-old Lillian Doy's room. Lillian was physically disabled and unable to fight back. The intruder beat her and bound her with thumb cuffs, cruelly immobilizing her. While Lillian lay terrified, Ramirez ransacked the home for valuables, then returned to rape the helpless woman in her bed. Despite his grievous head wound, Bill Doy had not died immediately. Summoning the last of his strength, Bill managed to crawl to the phone and dial 911 for help before losing consciousness. This heroic act alerted police and paramedics, who arrived in time to rush Lillian to the hospital and save her life. Bill Doy, however, succumbed to his injuries and died. Lillian survived the attack, later providing police with a description of the assailant, again noting the foul odor and state of his teeth. She remembered his mouth was filled with rotting brown teeth, confirming the same man who attacked her had also attacked others. The Night Stalker's profile was growing. A foul-smelling, disheveled man who preyed on the elderly as well as the young. 2 weeks later, on May 29, 1985, Ramirez struck in the community of Monrovia. His victims this time were Mabel Ma Bell, 83, and her sister, Florence Nettie Lang, 81. The two elderly women shared a home and were in bed when Ramirez broke in. He found a hammer in the kitchen and used it to bludgeon the sisters in their bedrooms. Both women were brutally beaten into unconsciousness. Ramirez then took an electrical cord and shocked Mabel Bell with it, essentially torturing the 83-year-old woman as she lay comatose. In a twisted flourish, he drew a pentagram, a 5-pointed satanic star, on Mabel's thigh with her lipstick, and also scrawled pentagrams on the walls of the bedrooms. He sexually assaulted 81-year-old Florence Lang before leaving. Astonishingly, both women clung to life. They were found 2 days later, alive but in critical condition. The beating had been so vicious that they remained comatose. Mabel Bell would later die of her injuries on July 15th, and Florence Lang would succumb in the hospital in early August, raising the Night Stalker's death toll further. The use of a satanic symbol at this crime scene terrified the public and baffled police. It was clear now that the killer relished cruelty and psychological horror. He wasn't just murdering, he was taunting society with devil worship imagery. The very next night, May 30th, 1985, Ramirez stole another car and drove to Burbank. He randomly chose the home of Carol Kyle, a 42-year-old mother, and broke in at gunpoint. Carol and her 11-year-old son were startled awake to see a pistol in their faces. Ramirez handcuffed mother and son together and shoved them into a closet while he looted the house. He then dragged Carol out of the closet and forced her to show him where the valuables were. Over the next several hours, Carol endured a nightmare. Ramirez repeatedly raped her at gunpoint. During the assault, he warned her not to look at his face. He told Carol that if she looked at him, he would cut her eyes out. The petrified woman obeyed, keeping her eyes tightly shut. Carol's young son remained locked in the closet, listening to his mother's ordeal. Finally, Ramirez brought the boy out and tied mother and son together again, leaving them alive as he fled. Though traumatized, Carol Kyle and her child survived. Carol was able to give police more details. Notably, the attacker had horribly foul breath and grotesquely decayed teeth, consistent with previous reports. The picture of the Night Stalker sharpened further. He was a sadistic rapist who derived pleasure from terrorizing victims of all ages. He also showed a willingness to leave victims alive if it suited his needs or whims, adding to the unpredictable nature of his crimes. By now, the entire Los Angeles region was in a state of panic. In June 1985, as more attacks piled up, more people began reinforcing their homes with extra locks, bars on windows, and guard dogs. Neighborhood watch groups swelled with new members. Gun shops reported a surge in sales of firearms, especially handguns, to frighten citizens. Everyone was talking about the Night Stalker, and yet, officially, police were circumspect about linking the crimes. The Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department and LAPD had formed a joint task force, working closely with the FBI, but they were keeping many details under wraps. Still, leaks and rumors spread. By early August, authorities finally confirmed what many suspected. A single serial killer was responsible for a string of murders and assaults. On August 8th, Sheriff Sherman Block acknowledged to the press that the latest murder was part of an ongoing series, and that a serial killer is loose in Southern California. It was the first public admission of the Night Stalker's rampage, and it sent shockwaves through the community. The moniker Night Stalker, which some reporters had already been using, now became the official name of Los Angeles' living nightmare. Meanwhile, Ramirez's spree continued, unabated, in June and July. On July 27, 1985, a 32-year-old schoolteacher named Patty Higgins was murdered in Arcadia. She was found with her throat slashed ear to ear. At the time, this crime wasn't immediately tied to the Night Stalker, but it would later be suspected as his handiwork. Ramirez was even charged in Patty's murder at one point, though the charge was dropped to insufficient evidence connecting it to the others. The very next week, less than 2 miles away, the Night Stalker struck definitively. On July 2, 1985, 75-year-old Mary Louise Cannon, a widowed grandmother, was found dead in Arcadia. Ramirez had quietly entered her home at night. He bludgeoned Mary with a lamp as she slept, then grabbed a 10-inch butcher knife from her kitchen and stabbed her repeatedly. The elderly woman was stabbed to death in her own bed, and the killer once again escaped into the darkness. 3 nights later, on July 5, 1985, a 16-year-old girl named Whitney Bennett became one of the Night Stalker's youngest victims, and one of his luckiest survivors. Whitney lived with her family in Sierra Madre. Ramirez broke into her bedroom in the middle of the night and attacked the sleeping teen with a tire iron from her family's garage. He beat Whitney savagely, inflicting deep lacerations on her scalp. She woke up to excruciating pain and the vision of a wild-eyed maniac raising a weapon over her. In the kitchen, Ramirez rummaged for a knife to finish her off, but couldn't find one. So he returned and wrapped a telephone cord around Whitney's neck, attempting to strangle her to death. As he pulled the cord tight, sparks suddenly erupted from the electrical cord. The phone began to flash with tiny blue lights. At that same moment, Whitney gasped and began to breathe, though unconscious. Ramirez, a fervent Satanist, was startled by what he perceived as a sign of divine intervention. He later claimed that he saw sparks and believed that Jesus Christ had saved the girl's life. Panicking, Ramirez fled the scene instead of finishing the job. Whitney Bennett was left alive, suffering severe injuries. It took 478 stitches to close the wounds in her scalp, but she survived. When she recovered enough to speak, Whitney couldn't recall details of her attacker's face. Still, the crime itself further fed the mythos of the Night Stalker. Even he apparently thought some higher power might be opposing him. when Whitney inexplicably lived. On July 7, 1985, Ramirez's violence reached another peak of frenzy. He drove to Monterey Park and hunted for victims. That night, he found two. First was Joyce Lucille Nelson, age 61, who lived alone in a modest home. Ramirez broke in and encountered Nelson asleep on her living room couch. In a rage, perhaps frustrated by Whitney's escape 2 nights prior, he stomped on Joyce Nelson's face with his sneaker-clad foot repeatedly until she was dead. The ferocity of the attack was such that the imprint of his Avia shoe was left bruised on the woman's face. Ramirez then prowled the neighborhood and found another target nearby, the home of Sophie Dickman, 63. He entered Sophie's house before dawn, armed with his gun. He assaulted the older woman, handcuffed her, and attempted to rape her. Sophie was terrified and pleaded for her life. Ramirez stole her jewelry, demanding she tell him if she had anything else of value. When Sophie swore that he had taken everything, he growled at her to swear on Satan that she was telling the truth. Only after she did so did the Night Stalker flee, again leaving a traumatized victim alive. By now, Ramirez was explicitly invoking Satan during his crimes, forcing his victims to profess loyalty to the devil as he terrorized them. This was psychological terror on top of physical violence. Word of this detail soon leaked, adding a chilling religious twist to the public's perception of the killer. The wave of terror continued into late July 1985. On July 20th, Richard Ramirez went on a murderous rampage that spanned 2 counties in one night. He began by purchasing a machete from a hardware store, a new weapon to add to his arsenal of knives, guns, and blunt objects. That night, he drove a stolen Toyota to Glendale, a city just south of LA. There, he randomly selected the house of Maxon Niding, 68, and his wife, Layla Niding, 66. Sometime in the early morning hours, Ramirez burst into the sleeping couple's bedroom. Without any prelude, he began hacking at them with the machete. The sharp blade sliced into their bodies, but the machete alone didn't kill them. Ramirez then pulled out his .22 caliber handgun and shot each of them in the head, finishing the job. Still not satisfied, he used the machete further to mutilate their bodies post-mortem. The scene in the Niding home was utter carnage. Blood spattered across the walls and bed, the victims nearly unrecognizable from the violence. But Ramirez did not linger. He had more evil to commit that night. He drove on to the suburb of Sun Valley and San Fernando Valley, arriving before dawn. There, he broke into the home of the Covenant family. In the house were 32-year-old Chainarong Covenant, his 32-year-old wife Som Kid, and their 8-year-old son. Ramirez crept into their bedroom and shot Chainarong in the head with his .22 caliber pistol as he slept, killing him instantly. Som Kid awoke to her husband's blood spattering her and the sight of a grinning killer. Ramirez beat the screaming woman and raped her repeatedly next to her husband's dead body. He then bound the terrified 8-year-old boy and dragged Som Kid around the house, demanding she reveal any hidden cash or valuables. She gave up whatever she could, and Ramirez stole valuables, including jewelry. During this ordeal, he made Som Kid swear to Satan that she wasn't hiding any money. Satisfied he had looted everything, he left the woman and her child alive and fled. Som Kid Covenant ran to a neighbor for help after freeing her son. She provided the now familiar description of a tall, filthy, curly-haired Hispanic man with bad teeth. That night's double event, the Nidings and the Covenants, brought the known death toll attributed to the Night Stalker to double digits. The randomness and brutality of the crimes plunged Southern California into hysteria. The Glendale and Sun Valley attacks were front-page news. What kind of person could slaughter an elderly couple with a machete and then sexually torture a young mother in the same night? By now, the Night Stalker's notoriety had eclipsed that of any local criminal in recent memory. Los Angeles broadcast media instructed people on how to beef up home security, and many families took to sleeping in shifts. Someone was awake at all times, on guard. Citizens were urged to keep windows closed and locked, even on hot summer nights. Fear and anxiety gripped the Southland, and tips flooded police hotlines with reports of suspicious strangers. Amid this climate of terror, Ramirez was relishing the chaos. He closely followed news coverage of his crimes, feeding off the media attention. Yet he also realized the dragnet was closing in. Investigators Salerno and Carrillo had crucial evidence: the bullets, the shoe prints, and now multiple surviving witnesses who could describe the killer. Composite sketches were circulating, and the pressure on law enforcement to catch the Night Stalker was enormous. Ramirez decided to change his hunting ground. He left the Los Angeles area and drove north. On August 17, 1985, the Night Stalker surfaced in the city of San Francisco. In a quiet neighborhood, he broke into the home of Peter and Barbara Pan. Peter Pan, 66, was asleep in bed when Ramirez entered. Ramirez shot Peter in the temple with a .22 caliber handgun at point-blank range, killing him instantly. He then beat and sexually assaulted 62-year-old Barbara Pan before shooting her in the head as well and leaving her for dead. On the bedroom wall, Ramirez scrawled a message in lipstick, a pentagram, and the words "Jack the Knife," an eerie phrase possibly referencing a song or simply his self-image as a new Jack the Ripper. He also left another familiar clue, a shoe print from his Avia sneakers. Miraculously, Barbara Pan survived the attack despite the gunshot wound to her head. She managed to crawl to the phone and call for help after Ramirez fled. When San Francisco detectives arrived, they immediately linked the crime to the Night Stalker. The modus operandi and the shoe print matched the Southern California cases. For the first time, the killer had struck outside the Los Angeles area, and it made headlines upstate. San Francisco's mayor at the time, Dianne Feinstein, held a press conference to assure the public that everything possible was being done. Unfortunately, in doing so, she leaked some crucial details of the investigation. Mayor Feinstein revealed the caliber of gun used and mentioned the unique Avia shoe prints, information which police had hoped to keep secret. The detectives on the case were furious. They knew the killer avidly followed the news, and indeed he did. Watching the mayor on television, Richard Ramirez realized the evidence that was leading police to him. That very night, he took his size 11.5 Avia sneakers, the only pair of that size in California, and dumped them off the Golden Gate Bridge into the waters below. Thus, a key piece of evidence was lost. Thanks to the public disclosure, Ramirez lingered in the Bay Area for a few more days. But with Barbara Pan surviving and the investigation intensifying, he sensed that Northern California was becoming too dangerous for him. By late August, the Night Stalker returned to Los Angeles to continue his one-man crime wave. But his days of freedom were numbered. August 24, 1985 would mark the final night of terror, though at the time, no one knew it yet. That evening, Ramirez drove a stolen orange Toyota down to Mission Viejo, an upscale community in Orange County, about 50 miles south of LA. Around 11 p.m., he attempted to break into the house of the Romero family, whose home he had spotted earlier. Inside, 13-year-old James Romero III was awake late, tinkering in the garage after returning from a family vacation in Mexico. James heard a rustling sound outside and became alert. Peering out, he saw a tall, thin man in dark clothes prowling around the house. Sensing danger, the quick-thinking teenager woke his parents and shouted that someone was trying to break in. The Romeros managed to scare the prowler off. Ramirez, cursing in frustration, ran to his car and sped away into the night. But James Romero did something that would prove crucial. He noted the color, make, and partial license plate number of the suspicious car. He called the police to report the attempted break-in and the car description. At the time, the family thought perhaps they had chased away a burglar. They had no idea they'd just foiled the Night Stalker. This was the first big break for law enforcement. The stolen Toyota was soon found abandoned in Los Angeles, and forensics examiners lifted a single fingerprint from the rearview mirror. Thanks to a recently acquired computerized fingerprint database, this single print was positively matched to a known criminal, Richard Ramirez, whose 1984 auto theft arrest had put his prints on file. Detectives suddenly had a name and face for the Night Stalker. It was, as one investigator put it, a near miracle. If not for that new system, Ramirez might have remained anonymous. Police also learned that Ramirez was a 25-year-old drifter from Texas, with a long rap sheet of petty crimes and drug arrests. The pieces were falling into place, at last. Oblivious to these rapid developments, Ramirez still had one more gruesome attack ahead of him that night. After fleeing Mission Viejo, he drove to another neighborhood that same night. In the community of Lake Forest, he broke into the home of Bill Carnes, 30, and his fiancée, Inez Erickson, 29. The couple was asleep when Ramirez slipped into their bedroom. He cocked his .25 caliber handgun, the clicking sound waking Bill Carnes. Before Carnes could react, Ramirez shot him 3 times in the head. Incredibly, Bill Carnes did not die instantly. He would later survive, against all odds, though gravely wounded. Ramirez then turned his attention to Inez. He beat her with his fists, bound her with neckties, and demanded she swear her love for Satan as he struck her. Terrified, Inez Erickson murmured whatever he asked. The intruder dragged her from room to room, collecting valuables and money. He then brutally raped her in their spare bedroom. Throughout the assault, he kept telling her he was the Night Stalker. By now, Ramirez had fully embraced the terrifying persona that the media had given him. Before he left, he looked into Inez's eyes and chillingly whispered, "Tell them the Night Stalker was here." Then he was gone, disappearing into the night for the last time. Bleeding and in agony, Inez Erickson struggled to her feet once she was sure he had fled. She untied herself and ran to a neighbor's house to get help. Both she and Bill Carnes, who miraculously still had a pulse, were rushed to the hospital. Surgeons managed to remove 2 of the bullets from Carnes's skull, saving his life. Bill Carnes would live, though the attack left him with permanent injuries. Importantly, Inez Erickson had gotten a clear view of her assailant and provided police with a detailed description, matching the curly-haired, bad-toothed profile of Richard Ramirez. The noose was tightening fast on the Night Stalker. Within 48 hours, detectives finally had the break they needed. A single fingerprint pulled from a stolen orange Toyota abandoned in Koreatown matched Richard Ramirez. His name, face, and criminal record were now in police hands. The 1984 mugshot they retrieved revealed the same hollow-eyed young man that survivors like Maria Hernandez and Inez Erickson remembered. On August 29, 1985, police unveiled that image at a press conference, plastering it across newspapers and television screens statewide. "We know who you are now, and soon everyone else will. There will be no place you can hide," LAPD declared. The Night Stalker's cloak of anonymity had been stripped away. Unaware he had been identified, Ramirez slipped out of Los Angeles before his face hit the evening news. On August 30th, he boarded a Greyhound, bound for Tucson, to see his brother. The trip was fruitless. His brother wasn't there, and Ramirez drifted through the night alone. By dawn of August 31st, he was on a bus heading back to Los Angeles. Authorities had anticipated the move, staking out the bus station. Yet when Ramirez walked through, gaunt and unnoticed, the officers failed to recognize him. He stepped into the streets of downtown Los Angeles, hunted, but free. At a convenience store, he picked up a newspaper only to see his own face staring back from the front page. Every major outlet carried the mugshot, including the Spanish language La Opinión, branding him Invasor Nocturno. Elderly women outside the store recognized him instantly, whispering El Matador. Panic washed over Ramirez. He dropped the paper and ran, bolting across the Santa Ana freeway in broad daylight. In desperation, he tried to seize a Ford Mustang, forcing his way inside and attempting to drag out the female driver. Bystander Faustino Piñón rushed to help, joined by his friend Jose Burgoyne, and together they hauled Ramirez from the car. He broke free, sprinting into the Boyle Heights neighborhood, a community much like those he had once terrorized. Attempting another car theft from Angelina Della Torre, he was stopped by her husband Manuel, who chased him down wielding a metal fence post. One strike to the head sent Ramirez sprawling. By now, the streets had awakened. Residents recognized the gaunt figure as the Night Stalker whose face filled every paper. Shouts rang out, and a mob formed. Dozens of ordinary citizens, many from immigrant families, descended on him. They beat him savagely, fists and steel bars raining down. The once feared predator cried out, begging for police to save him from the furious crowd. Around 8 a.m., officers finally arrived in response to the chaos. What they found was not the untouchable phantom who had terrorized California, but a battered, bloodied man pinned by his neighbors. Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker, was finally in custody. The irony was stark. The killer who had stalked and brutalized strangers had been brought down, not by elite detectives, but by the very people he thought powerless against him. In broad daylight, on a Boyle Heights street, the nightmare ended. After Ramirez's violent capture on the streets of Los Angeles, his path through the courts was anything but quick. He faced a staggering number of charges spread across multiple jurisdictions: murders, attempted murders, sexual assaults, and burglaries committed in Los Angeles County, Orange County, and San Francisco. Sorting through evidence and arguments dragged the pretrial process out for nearly 3 years. And all the while, Ramirez's notoriety only grew. From the start, he made his presence unforgettable. At his arraignment, he lifted his palm to reveal a pentagram scrawled on the skin and shouted "Hail Satan" to the stunned courtroom. It was a clear message. He would embrace the monster the world believed him to be. When jury selection finally began in 1988, followed by the trial in January 1989, Ramirez leaned into that dark persona. He appeared in court dressed in black, wearing sunglasses, projecting menace. To the shock of many, he had even attracted a following. Self-proclaimed Satanists and morbid fans who filled the gallery dressed in black, flashing devil horn hand signs, even marking their bodies with pentagrams. Ramirez smiled at them, occasionally winking, feeding off the bizarre energy. Security was a constant concern. Guards overheard him talking about smuggling a gun into the courtroom to kill the prosecutor, prompting strict searches and metal detectors. Fear escalated when, mid-trial, juror Phyllis Singletary failed to appear and was later found murdered, though it was soon revealed to be a domestic tragedy unrelated to Ramirez. The chilling timing left jurors shaken. The atmosphere of dread hung heavy over the trial, amplifying his already sinister presence. Finally, on September 20th, 1989, the jury delivered its verdict: guilty on all 43 counts, including 13 murders, 5 attempted murders, 11 sexual assaults, and 14 burglaries. 2 weeks later, they unanimously recommended the death penalty on 19 counts. On November 7th, Ramirez was formally sentenced to die in California's gas chamber. He greeted the decision with mocking indifference, smirking at reporters and saying, "Big deal. Death always went with the territory. See you in Disneyland." He never once showed remorse. When pressed about his motives, he deflected, with no comment, while investigators concluded that his only goal was simply to kill. The presiding judge remarked, his crimes revealed cruelty and callousness beyond any human understanding. The trial itself cost $1.8 million, the most expensive in California until the O.J. Simpson case years later. But for the families of victims, no cost was too high to secure justice. Though convicted and condemned, Ramirez remained a disturbing figure. His cult of admirers never vanished, and his name lingered in popular culture. For many in Los Angeles, the verdict finally closed the bloody chapter of 1985. Yet the man who called himself the Night Stalker continued to cast a long shadow from death row. Following his sentencing, Richard Ramirez was sent to California's San Quentin State Prison, home of the state's death row. There he joined scores of other condemned inmates awaiting execution. California's appeals process is lengthy, and Ramirez's case was no exception. It would be decades before his legal appeals were exhausted. In the meantime, the Night Stalker became an object of morbid fascination, even romance for some. Starting in the mid-1980s, while he was still awaiting trial, Ramirez had begun receiving letters from admirers, people who were inexplicably attracted to the dark legend. Among these was a freelance magazine editor named Doreen Leoy. Beginning in 1985, Doreen wrote nearly 75 letters to Ramirez in prison. She was convinced of his innocence and said she saw the real Richard behind the media's monster image. Ramirez and Leoy became close correspondents, and in 1988 he proposed marriage to her. On October 3, 1996, Richard Ramirez married Doreen Leoy in a simple ceremony inside San Quentin's walls. The bride was 41, the groom 36. Leoy publicly proclaimed her love for Ramirez, calling him kind and funny. She asserted that she would commit suicide on the day he was executed, so they could go together. Her family disowned her because of the marriage. The spectacle of a notorious serial killer marrying a fan behind bars added another layer to the Ramirez mystique. Many couldn't comprehend what would drive someone to wed a man guilty of such heinous acts. Despite Leoy's devotion, as years passed, even she found it hard to ignore the truth of Ramirez's crimes. In 2009, new forensic evidence came to light that conclusively tied Ramirez to the April 1984 rape and murder of 9-year-old Mei Leung. This revelation apparently disturbed Doreen Leoy greatly. Though there's no official divorce record, it was reported that Leoy severed contact with Ramirez after learning he had murdered a child. By the time of Ramirez's death, the two were estranged. Meanwhile, another woman, a 23-year-old named Christine Lee, claimed on a 2013 TV interview that she was now Ramirez's fiancée. Even in prison, the Night Stalker had a twisted allure for some, a fact that continues to fascinate and repulse observers in equal measure. Locked in San Quentin, Richard Ramirez's health began to decline. Years of drug abuse had taken a toll, and prison life added more strain. He suffered from chronic hepatitis C, likely from intravenous drug use or other risky behavior before prison. His teeth, which had been rotten at the time of his arrest, were actually treated by prison dentists. He received a few root canals and fillings while awaiting trial, meaning the Night Stalker ended up with better dental health in prison than during his rampage. Still, larger problems loomed. In 2003, Ramirez was diagnosed with B-cell lymphoma, a form of blood cancer. As he sat on death row, his execution date still distant due to endless appeals, Ramirez's own body became his executioner. On June 7, 2013, Richard Ramirez died at age 53 at Marin General Hospital in Green Bay, California. The official cause of death was complications from B-cell lymphoma, along with chronic substance abuse and hepatitis C contributing to his poor health. In the end, the serial killer who had brought so much death succumbed to natural causes, while the state's justice system was still processing his appeals. He spent 23 years on death row, but never reached the gas chamber that his victims' families might have felt he deserved. Thanks for joining us for another Fridays with Tony. Be sure to like, subscribe, and leave a comment down below if you have any thoughts about this story. This was a sick one, and I'm a little shaken after telling this story. The depths of horror that people will go to for no good reason is amazingly disturbing. Well, I'll see you next week on Fridays with Tony, where we'll have another story that's unusual, unsettling, maybe unsolved.